As we have seen, British engineers organized themselves into self-regulating professional associations, while in the United States, a state licensing culture arose. As these developments took place, issues of relationships between the client and engineer arose, complicating matters of professional behavior. As the 19th century progressed, engineering projects became more complex, and so did the relationship between the client and the engineer. For example, in 1867, Sanford Fleming, the engineer-in-chief of the Intercolonial Railway, and the railway commissioners were in conflict. The commissioners preferred cheaper wooden bridges, whereas Fleming wanted more durable stone and iron bridges. Fleming appealed to the Prime Minister. When that failed, he went to the Privy Council in London, which backed him up. The bridges were built using iron and stone, saving the railway money in the long term. Fleming was also instrumental in other projects that served the public interest. He promoted the adoption of standard time. He went on to champion the idea of time zones, a concept that was eventually adopted worldwide. In 1879, Fleming proposed laying an underwater telegraph cable across the Pacific, linking Canada to New Zealand and Australia. Fleming was unrelenting in his pursuit of this idea. He bombarded Ottawa with memoranda and repeated his message at colonial conferences. Finally, in 1899, the idea was accepted and the cable under the Pacific was completed in 1902. Fleming combined his specialized engineering knowledge with his interest in public service to benefit society. He put his ideas into effect by reaching out to his fellow engineers through correspondence and conferences. As client engineer issues, like those faced by Fleming, arose, engineering associations began to develop explicit codes of ethics. Early self-regulation practice favored enhancing public perception, loyalty to the profession, and to employers. This naturally led to many ethical conflicts of interest. An example of a conflict of loyalty occurred in the 1930s. Two engineers from the American Society of Civil Engineers reported a Los Angeles Water Department contractor for taking bribes. This resulted in convictions for those involved. But it also resulted in the expulsion of the two engineers from the American Society of Civil Engineers for violating professional ethics and injuring the reputation of a brother engineer. As the 20th century progressed, engineers began to see themselves as the leaders of the new technocracy. But with increasingly complex technology, it became more and more difficult for end users to remain informed of their own best interests. A number of engineering associations came together and formed societies to promote consistency across the profession, including regulation, training, education, ethics, and licensing. In 1932, the Engineers' Council for Professional Development was established. This was dedicated to the education, accreditation, regulation, and professional development of engineering professionals and students in the United States. In Canada, the Canadian Council of Professional Engineers was formed in 1936. It promoted consistency in the educational standards, regulatory, and licensing practice of its members. But it was not until 1965 that the Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board was set up to accredit university programs and ensure graduates could register as professional engineers in Canada. To further separate public interests from the self-interest of engineers, the National Society of Professional Engineers was founded in America in 1934. It focused on non-technical issues including legislation, public perception of the profession, and professional compensation. In 1946, the NSPE released its first canons of ethics and rules of professional conduct for engineers. In 1947, the ECPD adopted an ethics code that made it a duty for engineers to interest themselves in public welfare. It was not until 1976 that the Canadian counterpart to the NPSE, the Canadian Society for Professional Engineers, was formed. After the Second World War, engineers became increasingly aware of the social impact of their work. Events ranging from the atomic bomb, 3 Mile Island, the Ford Pinto case, and the Union Carbide explosion at Bhopal, India, drew extensive public attention to engineers and their work. Social critics, the media, and even engineers themselves began to examine the social responsibilities of engineering. In 1981, the evolution of the NSPE code led to the adoption of a short list of fundamental canons, the first of which was to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. In Anglo-American engineering culture, codes of professional ethics have become a convention between professionals. In choosing how to practice their profession, engineers must take into account the views of their engineering associations. In this context, engineers cannot depend on private conscience, as in the case with engineers in cultures derived from the French, German, and other European academic traditions. In spite of all the reforms that have taken place to produce today's codes of ethics, the idea that most engineering ethics problems were generated by business dominated much of the work in the 1980s and early 1990s. By the 1980s, these ideas had entered the universities and the field of engineering ethics was formed. In early codes of ethics, behavior was determined by a mixture of technical knowledge and expectations of professional etiquette. These codes developed to encompass ideas of social responsibility, safety, health, and public welfare. Even though engineers are increasingly aware of the social impact of their work, they still must practice within the context of business interests.